Somewhere in the Andes Mountains of Peru, at an elevation so high that the air is thin and cold and the clouds drift below you rather than above, there is a city made entirely of stone. Not a ruin exactly, though it is very old, built in the mid-1400s, but something more like a frozen moment. The walls still stand. The terraces still cascade down the mountainside in perfect, graceful steps. The stones, some of them weighing as much as 50 tons, fit together so precisely that you cannot slip a sheet of paper between them. Even now, even after 500 years of earthquakes and rain and the slow green creep of the jungle reaching up from the valley below. There was no mortar. There were no written blueprints. There were no iron tools. There were no wheels. The people who built this place, this city called Machu Picchu, this house in the clouds, had none of the things we usually associate with great construction. And yet what they made has outlasted nearly everything the Spanish built to replace it. That city is just one detail. One small, dazzling detail in a story that stretches back thousands of years, that encompasses millions of people spread across 2,500 miles of the most geographically extreme terrain on Earth, that includes the rise of one of humanity's most sophisticated civilizations and its sudden violent collision with the forces of European conquest. It is a story of gods and gold and engineering genius. It is a story about what happens when a small highland tribe looks out at the mountains around them and decides that all of it, every peak, every river, every valley, every coast, belongs to them by divine right. And it is a story that has not ended. Not really. Not when millions of people still speak the language of the Inca today. Not when farmers in the high Andes still plant crops on terraces built by those same hands 5 centuries ago. The empire fell. The civilization did not. Tonight we are going to go there together. We are going to travel back to the Andes before the Inca, back to the civilizations that first broke ground, first figured out how to farm at altitude, first built monuments and temples and roads through impossible terrain. We are going to follow the thread from those earliest societies all the way forward to the founding of Cuzco, the rise of Pachacuti and the transformation of a small kingdom into the largest empire the Americas had ever seen, the strange and complete cosmology that the Inca used to make sense of their world, the roads and the bridges and the knotted strings they used to hold it all together, and finally the catastrophic arrival of Francisco Pizarro and fewer than 200 men who somehow, through a combination of timing, disease, political fracture, and extraordinary audacity, brought the whole astonishing structure down. If this is your first time here on The Drowsy Archivist, welcome. This channel exists for the moments when the day is done and you want something long and rich and immersive. Not entertainment exactly, but a kind of quiet company, history told slowly, the way it deserves to be told. If you've been here before, you know the rhythm. Pull up a blanket. Get comfortable. And if you find tonight's journey valuable, a like or a subscription helps this channel keep going, and it means more than you probably realize. Now, let us begin at the very beginning, which in the Andes is a very, very long time ago. To understand the Inca, you need to first understand the world they inherited, because the Inca did not appear from nowhere. They were not the first people to look at the Andes and decide to build something magnificent. They were, in many respects, the inheritors of thousands of years of accumulated Andean knowledge, accumulated farming technique, accumulated religious sensibility, accumulated architectural ambition, and what made them extraordinary was not merely that they built something new, but that they built something new out of everything that had come before them. The Andes themselves are among the youngest major mountain ranges on Earth, geologically speaking, pushed upward by the collision of the Nazca tectonic plate burrowing beneath the South American plate, a process that began roughly 4 million years ago. The result is the longest mountain range in the world, running nearly 4,500 miles along the entire western spine of South America, with peaks exceeding 20,000 feet above sea level, with altiplano plateaus sitting at heights that would leave most of us breathless and dizzy within minutes of arrival, with valleys so deep and narrow that entire microclimates exist within just a few miles of each other. This geography was not easy to live in. It was profoundly challenging. And the civilizations that emerged here were shaped, in almost every way, by that challenge. People arrived in the Andes at least 15,000 years ago, moving southward from North America in migrations that followed game animals across the continent. By around 3000 BCE, some of the earliest permanent agricultural settlements in the Americas were taking root on the Peruvian coast and in coastal river valleys, places where the Humboldt Current kept the Pacific cold and rich with marine life, where anchovies and shellfish and sea lions could supplement whatever crops the dry land would yield. One of the most striking of these early sites is Caral, in the Supe Valley of Peru, which was already a substantial city by around 2600 BC, roughly contemporary with the construction of the Great Pyramid of Giza in Egypt. Caral had monumental platform mounds, sunken circular plazas, residential districts, and evidence of sophisticated management of food resources. It is among the oldest urban centers in the entire Western Hemisphere. But the story that leads most directly to the Inca really begins gathering momentum around 900 BCE, with the emergence of what archaeologists call the Chavín culture. Centered on the remarkable ceremonial site of Chavín de Huántar, located in a mountain valley in north-central Peru at an altitude of about 10,200 feet, the Chavín were not an empire in any conventional sense. They did not conquer territory by force, did not impose a centralized government, did not demand tribute in the way the Inca would later do. What they did instead was something arguably more powerful. They spread a religious worldview. Chavín de Huántar was a pilgrimage destination, a place where priests and shamans and local elites from distant communities would travel to consult oracles, to receive visions, to participate in rituals that likely involved psychoactive substances. The San Pedro cactus, containing mescaline, has been found in association with the site's ceremonial contexts. The art and iconography of Chavín, its fanged deities, its imagery merging human, feline, bird, and serpent forms into complex composite beings, spread across an enormous area of Peru from the coast to the highlands, carried not by armies but by the persuasive power of a shared spiritual language. Chavín influence lasted from roughly 900 BCE to about 200 BCE, and in its wake came the great regional flowering of Andean art and culture. Along the southern coast of Peru, in the river valleys near the modern town of Nazca, a civilization we call the Nazca was developing one of the most sophisticated textile traditions in the ancient world, as well as the enigmatic geoglyphs, enormous designs etched into the desert pampa, that we know today as the Nazca lines. These lines, some of them stretching for miles, depicting birds, spiders, hummingbirds, spirals, and geometric shapes visible only from the air, have puzzled observers ever since their rediscovery in the 20th century. The most convincing explanations connect them to water rituals and astronomical alignments. The Nazca lived in a desert and were acutely preoccupied with water, building remarkable underground aqueduct systems called puquios that still function today to channel water through the dry coastal landscape. Their polychrome ceramics, painted in rich reds and oranges and blacks and whites, depicted the same supernatural beings and ritual scenes that would echo through Andean imagery for centuries. In the north, roughly contemporaneous with the Nazca but inhabiting a completely different landscape, the Moche civilization was building something closer to a true state. The Moche, also sometimes called the Machaca, flourished along the north coast of Peru from roughly 100 CE to about 800 CE, constructing large urban centers around monumental adobe brick pyramids, the most famous being the Huaca del Sol, the Temple of the Sun, near the modern city of Trujillo, which was built from an estimated 143 million individual mud bricks and stood roughly 40 meters tall. The Moche were brilliant artisans, perhaps the greatest ceramic artists of the ancient Americas. Their portrait vessels, jars molded into the likenesses of specific individuals, with fine attention to facial expression and physical detail, suggest an artistic ambition and a sense of individual identity that feels startlingly modern. They also depicted in their ceramics everything from ritual combat and sacrifice to daily agricultural life to explicit sexual imagery, giving archaeologists an unusually rich window into the textures of Moche society. The Moche world was not gentle. Their warrior elite engaged in ritual combat, and the losers, high-status captives, were sacrificed in elaborate ceremonies atop the platform mounds. Excavations at the site of Huaca de la Luna have revealed layers of sacrifice victims, along with murals depicting the principal beings of the Moche supernatural world. The Moche did not survive their own 5th and 6th centuries intact. Climate disruption, likely driven by a severe and prolonged series of El Niño events, brought catastrophic flooding to some valleys and drought to others, undermining the agricultural systems that sustained the coastal cities. The great urban centers of the Moche South declined, and the cultural energy shifted, northward to new Moche polities and inland toward the highlands. It is in the highlands and in the southern Altiplano around Lake Titicaca. The two of the most important pre-Inca civilizations emerged during what archaeologists call the Middle Horizon, roughly 600 to 1000 CE. The first is Tiwanaku, centered at a remarkable city near the southern shore of Lake Titicaca, in what is now Bolivia, at an elevation of approximately 12,500 feet above sea level, an altitude so extreme that most cereal crops cannot grow there without careful management. The people of Tiwanaku solved this problem with a revolutionary form of agriculture called raised field farming, in which they built elevated garden beds surrounded by canals, so that the water in the canals could absorb heat during the day and release it slowly at night, keeping the crops warm enough to survive the frequent frosts of the Altiplano. This system, covering thousands of acres around Lake Titicaca, allowed Tiwanaku to sustain a large population in what would otherwise have been an inhospitable environment. Their architecture was monumental and striking, great gateways and platforms cut from enormous stone blocks, aligned with astronomical precision, decorated with the image of the staff god, a frontal figure holding staffs that would reappear in Inca religious iconography centuries later. The second great highland empire of the Middle Horizon was the Wari, centered near the modern Peruvian city of Ayacucho, to the north and west of Tiwanaku. The Wari were genuine imperialists. They expanded aggressively through military conquest, establishing provincial administrative centers across a huge stretch of Peru from the southern highlands to the northern coast. Their centers were laid out according to what appears to be a standardized architectural plan, with large rectangular enclosures divided into corridors and rooms that archaeologists believe served administrative and storage functions. The Wari are particularly important as precursors to the Inca because they were apparently among the first Andean peoples to use a version of the knotted string recording device that the Inca would later develop into their famous quipu system. They also built roads connecting their provincial centers, roads that the Inca would later incorporate and dramatically expand into the greatest highway network in the pre-Columbian Americas. Both Tiwanaku and Wari collapsed around 1000 CE, for reasons that are still debated. Prolonged drought, political fragmentation, internal rebellion, all likely played roles. In their wake, the Andean world broke into a patchwork of smaller, competing regional states. The Chimu on the north coast of Peru, ruling from their remarkable adobe capital at Chan Chan. The Chanca Confederation in the Central Highlands, various Aymara kingdoms around Lake Titicaca, and dozens of smaller groups scattered through the highland valleys. It was into this fragmented post-empire landscape, into this world of competing chiefdoms and small kingdoms still carrying the cultural inheritance of all that had come before, that a small group of highland people emerged from the Cuzco Valley in the early 13th century and began to ask themselves a question that would have seemed laughable at the time. What if all of this belonged to us? The Chimu, who controlled the northern Peruvian coast and had absorbed much of what had survived of the Moche tradition, deserve a particular mention because they were, at the time the Inca began their expansion, the largest and most sophisticated state on the continent outside of Tawantinsuyu itself. Their capital, Chan Chan, was built of adobe, sun-dried mud brick, rather than stone, because on the Peruvian coast stone is scarce and adobe abundant, and the Chimu turned this limitation into its own distinctive architectural grandeur. Chan Chan covered roughly 20 square kilometers and was organized around 9 massive royal compounds called ciudadelas, each one an enclosed palace complex built by a successive Chimu ruler. The walls of these compounds reached heights of 9 meters, their surfaces decorated with repeating geometric friezes of fish, birds, waves, and mythological beings rendered in molded adobe, three-dimensional relief sculpture on an architectural scale, visible from hundreds of meters away and designed to proclaim the wealth and power of the ruler within. When a Chimu ruler died, his ciudadela was sealed and maintained as his tomb and palace, cared for by his descendants, much as the Inca would later maintain the estates and mummies of their own dead emperors. The parallels between Chimu and Inca practice in this area are striking enough that historians debate whether the Inca borrowed the concept of the royal mummy estate from the Chimu when they finally conquered them, or whether both were independently expressing the same deep Andean cultural intuition about the role of the dead in the political life of the living. The Chimu were also brilliant engineers of water. Their cities sat at the edge of the Atacama Desert, one of the driest places on Earth, where coastal rivers descending from the Andes provided the only reliable water supply. The Chimu built elaborate irrigation networks channeling these rivers across the desert landscape to water their fields, some of the canals stretching for dozens of miles through terrain that required extraordinary surveying skill to navigate. When the Inca eventually conquered Chan Chan around 1470, they did not destroy it but incorporated it, maintaining its irrigation systems and transplanting its skilled craftsmen to Cuzco. That small group, that tribe of perhaps 15,000 souls living at 11,000 feet in a fertile valley surrounded by mountains, was the Inca. The Inca did not record their own history in writing. They had no alphabet, no hieroglyphs, no system of marks on a surface that translated directly into language. What they had instead were trained specialists called quipuquimeics, knot keepers, who maintained records on the knotted string devices called quipus, and they had a rich oral tradition transmitted through ritual song and storytelling, maintained by the royal lineages and the priests attached to each dead ruler's estate. When the Spanish arrived in the 16th century, they found survivors of the Old World who could still recite these traditions, and many of them set their accounts down for Spanish chroniclers who preserved them, with varying degrees of fidelity and understanding, in the colonial documents that are now among our primary sources for Inca history. What those sources tell us about the founding of the Inca civilization comes in two main forms, both mythological in character, both clearly serving the political purpose of legitimizing the rule of the Sapa Inca, the unique Inca, the emperor, by connecting his bloodline directly to the gods. The first and most widely known origin story is the Lake Titicaca legend. In this account, the sun god Inti looked down at the people of the world and saw that they were living in ignorance, without civilization, without law, without the knowledge of agriculture or proper worship. Moved by compassion, or perhaps by divine ambition, Inti sent two of his children down from the heavens to bring order to humanity. These were Manco Capac and his sister wife Mama Aclo, and they emerged not from the sky but from the dark, deep waters of Lake Titicaca itself, the world's highest navigable lake, a body of water so large and so vividly blue at high altitude that it seems almost unreal, that feels, when you stand on its shore, like a window into some other world. Inti gave them a golden staff, the Tapaciori, and told them to travel northward. Wherever the golden staff sank fully into the earth, that was where they should build a city and teach the people around them the arts of civilization. They traveled through the highlands, testing the ground at each promising location, until they reached a fertile valley where two small streams converged, at a place the locals called Acamama. There, the golden staff plunged all the way into the earth and did not rise again. Manco Capac set the staff aside, surveyed the valley, and began to build. The second origin story is more elaborate and has a different emotional register. Darker, more complex, full of sibling rivalry and transformation. In this version, called the Ayar Brothers legend, there were not 2 but 8 siblings who emerged from a cave called Tambo Taco, or House of Windows, located at Pachacuti Tambo, roughly 25 kilometers south of Cuzco. The 4 brothers were Ayar Manco, Ayar Cachi, Ayar Uchu, and Ayar Raka. The 4 sisters were Mama Aclo, Mama Rawa, Mama Huaco, and Mama Koya. Ayar Manco carried a staff of the finest gold. Together, these 8 beings and the 10 clans they led set out to find the promised land. But the journey was difficult, complicated by the brothers' own natures. Ayar Cachi was powerful and destructive. His slingshots split mountains and raised clouds of dust to the sky, and his brothers feared him. They tricked him into returning to the cave at Tambo Taco and sealed him inside. Ayar Ochu, at the mountain of Wanakori, leapt upon a stone idol he found there and was instantly transformed into stone himself. Only Ayar Manco pressed on, accompanied by his sisters. At the valley of Cuzco, his staff sank into the earth. He took the name Manco Capac, and there with his sisters he built the first Inca homes. Scholars and archaeologists have spent considerable energy trying to separate the historical core of these legends from their mythological overlay. What seems reasonably clear is this. In the early 13th century, perhaps around 1200 CE, though the dates are approximate at best, a group of people led by an individual who would be remembered as Manco Capac migrated from the Pachacuti region into the Cuzco Valley. They were not the only people there. The valley already had inhabitants, at least 3 other groups, the Suers, the Wallas, and the Alcahuses, and the newcomers had to fight for their place. Through a combination of force and political maneuvering, through strategic marriages and alliances and the occasional decisive battle, Manco Capac's group established themselves in the valley, in a marshy area between 2 small streams, in what is now the center of the modern city of Cuzco. The recently founded settlement was organized into 4 quarters. The Inca people organized themselves into clans, Ayllus, tracing descent from a common ancestor, living communally, working shared land, supporting each other through the obligations of kinship. From this modest beginning, Manco Capac would be remembered as the man who established the institutions, the religious practices, and the social organization that would eventually underpin the largest empire the Americas had ever seen. What did Manco Capac actually do, historically speaking? The chronicles tell us he taught the men of the region to cultivate maize, to build stone dwellings, to observe the sacred rites of the sun god Inti. He organized the people into Ayllus based on kinship, establishing the social unit that would remain the basic building block of Andean society for centuries. He constructed the first temple to Inti, a simple structure that would later be transformed into the magnificent Coricancha, the golden enclosure, the most sacred temple in the empire. He divided the valley's population into 2 moieties, Hanan Cusco, Upper Cusco, and Huron Cusco, Lower Cusco, a dual organization that would structure the political and religious life of the city for generations. He ruled as the first Sapa Inca, the unique or supreme Inca, and upon his death he was believed to have become a divine ancestor, his mummified body preserved and venerated, consulted on important matters of state, present at festivals and ceremonies, as real and as active in the lives of the living as he had been during his lifetime. Mama Aklo's role in the founding is, in many versions of the legend, equally essential. She taught the women of the valley to spin and weave and run households, skills that in the Andean context were not merely domestic but deeply sacred, as textile production was intimately connected to religious ceremony, to the worship of the gods, to the political economy of the empire that would follow. The finest textiles in the Andean world were not merely clothing but offerings, wealth, markers of identity and status, the medium through which the relationship between humans and gods was materially expressed. Mama Aklo, in this sense, was not a secondary figure in the founding myth but an architect of something as fundamental as Manco Capac himself. The valley they chose to settle was, in retrospect, a remarkably good choice for the seat of a future empire. Cuzco sits at an elevation of approximately 11,100 feet in the southern Andes, in a valley formed by two rivers, the Telemeo and the Guatanay, that join to flow northward into the larger Urubamba River, which runs through what the Inca would later call the Sacred Valley. The surrounding mountains provided both defense and spiritual resonance. Every peak was a god, an apu, a divine being whose moods affected rain and frost and the fortunes of those who lived beneath it. The valley floor was fertile and well-watered. The altitude, though demanding by the standards of lowlanders, was perfectly normal for the Andean peoples who had been adapting to high-altitude life for thousands of years. And its central position within the broader Andean geography made it, eventually, the perfect hub for an empire built on the movement of goods and people and information. But in the time of Manco Capac, all of that was still centuries away. The city he founded was modest. The valley he controlled was small. The kingdoms around him were more powerful. He was, in the beginning, simply one local leader among many, trying to hold his people together in a challenging landscape, trusting that the Golden Staff's decision was not a mistake. Between the death of Manco Capac and the ascension of the 9th Sapa Inca Pachacuti Inca Yupanqui, there lie roughly 2 centuries of Inca history that are, frankly, difficult to disentangle from legend. The names of 8 rulers are recorded: Sinchi Ruka Laki Yupanqui, Meda Capac, Capac Yupanqui, Inca Ruqa Uor Wakak, Wiracocha Inca, and finally Pachacuti himself. And the chronicles give each of them deeds and characteristics in military campaigns, but the chronology is uncertain, the details often contradictory between different sources, and the archaeological record thin enough that historians debate how much of what the chronicles tell us reflects genuine historical events and how much was invented or embellished to glorify the lineage and justify the empire's claims to divine authority. What seems clear from both the chronicles and the archaeological record is that the Inca under these early rulers were not yet an empire. They were something more modest, a kingdom, or perhaps more accurately a chiefdom, gradually expanding its control over the Cuzco Valley and the surrounding highlands through a combination of military force, strategic marriage, and the absorption of smaller neighboring groups into their political system. The Inca did not, as a rule, destroy the peoples they conquered during this period. They tended instead to incorporate them, to bring their leaders into the Inca system as subordinates, to adopt the most useful elements of their culture and technology while overlaying the whole with Inca religion and administrative organization. The 6th ruler, Inca Ruqa, is credited in the chronicles with beginning the expansion beyond the immediate Cuzco Valley, extending Inca control to the north and south along the highland corridor. The 7th, Uor Wakak, whose name translates poetically as he who weeps blood, supposedly navigated a period of internal conflict and external threat, reportedly including a kidnapping at the hands of the Anta people. His successor, the 8th ruler Wiracocha Inca, represents a somewhat more historically solid figure, associated in the chronicles with significant military expansion and with an increasing formalization of the Inca state, the development of a more elaborate court, a more clearly defined administrative hierarchy, a more systematic approach to the management of conquered territories. During these centuries of gradual growth, the Inca were developing and refining the political and cultural tools that would eventually power their explosive expansion. Among the most important of these was the concept of reciprocity, Aini in Quechua, which structured relationships at every level of Andean society, from the obligations between neighbors in a village to the relationship between the Sapa Inca and the gods themselves. In the Andean worldview, no transaction was purely extractive. Everything demanded a return. You gave labor, you received food and clothing. You gave offerings to the mountain spirits, they gave you rain and frost-free nights. You submitted to Inca authority, you received access to the state's storehouses in times of need. This cultural framework was not merely ideological, it was deeply practical, a mechanism for building trust and maintaining cooperation in a society without money or markets in the conventional sense, where everything depended on the coordination of human effort across vast distances and diverse communities. The Inca also refined the technique of conquest through incorporation that distinguished them from purely predatory empires. Rather than simply destroying what they found and replacing it wholesale with their own institutions, the Inca were skilled at finding what was valuable in the cultures they absorbed and making it their own. They adopted agricultural techniques from the coastal peoples, architectural innovations from the Altiplano cultures, weaving traditions from the various highland groups, and administrative methods that had been pioneered by the Wari. They were, in this sense, the culmination of Andean civilization rather than a disruption of it. A people who managed to synthesize the accumulated cultural capital of 10,000 years of Andean history into a single, powerful, coherent whole. But Waurucocha Inca is also associated in the chronicles with a moment of catastrophic failure that would become, paradoxically, the foundation of the empire's greatest triumph. During his reign, the powerful Chanca Confederation, a federation of highland groups to the northwest of Cuzco, based in the region of Ayacucho, launched a major invasion of the Cuzco Valley. The Chanca were formidable warriors, and their advance threatened to overwhelm the Inca entirely. According to the chronicles, Waurucocha Inca, old and perhaps weary of fighting, withdrew to a fort at Caquiazaquaxuana with his chosen heir, Inca Urco, abandoning Cuzco to its fate. The city seemed lost. Into this moment of crisis stepped one of the most remarkable figures in the history of the Americas. His birth name was Cuzco Yupanqui, Joyful Yupanqui. He was not Waurucocha Inca's favored son. That role belonged to Inca Urco. He was, by the standards of royal succession, a secondary figure, capable, clearly, ambitious certainly, but not the chosen one. When the Chanca came and his father fled, Cuzco Yupanqui refused to leave. He gathered what troops remained, rallied the people of Cuzco, and prepared to fight. The night before the battle, the chronicles say he received a divine vision, in some versions from Waurucocha the creator god, in others from Inti the sun god himself, in which he was promised divine aid. And the next day, when the Chanca army attacked, Cuzco Yupanqui led his forces out to meet them, and somehow, against all reasonable expectation, he won. The chronicles add a supernatural flourish. They say that the very stones of the battlefield rose up to fight alongside him, transforming into warriors called Puraracas, and that after the battle Cuzco Yupanqui gathered these stones and kept them as sacred objects for the rest of his life. This detail almost certainly reflects, in mythologized form, the reality that Cuzco Yupanqui's victory was decisive enough and dramatic enough to seem, to those who witnessed it, like divine intervention. He went on to defeat the Chanca in several further engagements, pursuing them far beyond Cuzco and effectively crushing their confederation as a political force. Waurucocha Inca, shamed by his own retreat and perhaps frightened by his son's sudden power, stripped Inca Urco of the succession and recognized Cuzco Yupanqui as heir. Whether Cuzco Yupanqui then deposed his father outright or waited for him to die naturally is not clear. The sources differ. But by around 1438 CE, Cuzco Yupanqui was the Sapa Inca, and he gave himself a new name, Pachacuti, which means, in Quechua, he who transforms the earth, or sometimes translated as earth shaker, or even most dramatically, reverser of the world. All of these translations capture something true about what was coming. If you had to choose one person whose decisions, whose vision, whose relentless ambition transformed the Inca from a regional highland kingdom into the greatest empire the Americas had ever known, that person would be Pachacuti. He reigned from approximately 1438 to 1471, 33 years during which the map of South America was fundamentally redrawn. He conquered, he built, he organized, he reformed, and he imagined, with a clarity and comprehensiveness that feels almost architectural, a new kind of state. He is, in many ways, the Inca version of Alexander or Augustus or Ashoka, the figure whose personal genius accelerated history, who compressed into one lifetime what might otherwise have taken centuries, and whose legacy shaped everything that came after. The first thing Pachacuti did after securing his power was transform Cuzco. Not improve it, transform it. The chronicles say he essentially demolished the existing city and rebuilt it from scratch, according to a new master plan that he himself designed. The new Cuzco was laid out in the form of a puma, a mountain lion. The city itself was the body of a sacred animal, with a massive fortress complex of Sacsayhuaman forming the head on a ridge above the city, the main plaza at the heart of the body, and the two rivers channeled and straightened to flow along the sides and converge at what was conceptually the tail. This was not simply urban planning. It was a statement about the nature of the city itself. Cuzco was not merely a capital, it was a living sacred being, a puma in stone, the embodiment of divine power laid across the landscape. At the center of the new Cuzco, Pachacuti built or dramatically rebuilt the Coricancha, the golden enclosure, the Temple of the Sun. This was the most sacred building in the empire, the house of Inti himself, and it was constructed with an attention to both engineering and magnificence that stunned the Spanish when they finally saw it in 1533. The walls were built of perfectly fitted stone, the same finger-jointed stonework that would define Inca architecture everywhere. Stones shaped with such precision that the joints between them were nearly invisible, the surfaces polished to a smoothness that seemed almost impossible given that the Inca worked without iron tools. The interior walls were reportedly sheathed in gold plate, thick sheets of hammered gold covering the stone surfaces entirely, so that the temple blazed in the mountain sunlight like the sun it was dedicated to. In the central courtyard stood a great golden disc representing Inti himself, positioned so that it caught and reflected the dawn light. Around the main temple were smaller chapels dedicated to Mama Quilla, the moon goddess, to Ilapa, the god of thunder and lightning, to Tsuecha, the rainbow, and to the Pleiades, the star cluster that regulated the Inca agricultural calendar. The mummified bodies of previous Sapa Incas were kept here as well, each in their own golden chair, each dressed in fine clothing, attended by servants, as present and as active in the life of the temple as any living person. Then Pachacuti turned outward. The conquest of the Chanca had demonstrated that the highland world was available for expansion, and Pachacuti proceeded to take it with a systematic efficiency that was itself a new kind of military and political technology. He first consolidated control over the entire Cusco region, bringing the various local groups firmly under Inca administration. He then moved north into the highland valleys of what is now central Peru, absorbing the various polities of the Chinchesiu region, conquering some by force, incorporating others through negotiation, using a standard pattern. Arrive with an overwhelming force, offer terms that preserved local leadership if they submitted, destroy those who resisted and resettle their populations. He moved southeast into the Titicaca Basin, conquering the Kala and Lupaca peoples who had dominated the Altiplano around Lake. Somewhere in the middle of this expansion, probably around 1450 CE, though the precise date is uncertain, Pachacuti paused his campaigns long enough to commission something that would become, 6 centuries later, the most recognized archaeological site in all of South America. High above the Urubamba River, on a mountain ridge between two peaks, Machu Picchu, the old mountain, and Huayna Picchu, the young mountain, he ordered the construction of a royal estate. We call this estate Machu Picchu. The site sits at approximately 7,970 feet above sea level, which is lower than Cusco itself. The sacred valley below it runs warmer and more productive than the high Altiplano. From its ridge, on a clear day, you can see in one direction the snowy peaks of the high Andes and in another direction the green descending slopes that lead toward the Amazon basin. The city was built on a narrow saddle between the two mountain peaks, with the mountain dropping precipitously on 3 sides, a natural defensive position of extraordinary strength. To create flat space for construction, Inca engineers built hundreds of terraces into the steep mountainside, some of them very broad and intended for agriculture, others narrow and steep, purely structural. They quarried granite from the mountain itself, from outcrops within the site, using a process of scoring and splitting that required enormous skill and patience but produced stones of remarkable precision. The famous interlocking stonework, stones cut to fit each other with hairline joints, no mortar, each stone slightly concave on its lower face to grip the stone beneath it, was specifically designed to be earthquake resistant. When tremors came, the stones would shift slightly and then settle back into place, the concave surfaces acting as natural cushions. It was not an accident. The Inca lived in earthquake country and they built accordingly. The city covered roughly 126 acres and could accommodate perhaps 1,000 people at its peak, a relatively small population for a royal estate, and one that suggests Machu Picchu was not a major administrative center but rather exactly what most archaeologists now believe it to have been. A private retreat for Pachacuti and his Panica, his royal lineage group, a place where he and his descendants could escape the political pressures of Cuzco, perform religious ceremonies in a landscape of extraordinary spiritual power, and spend the warmer months away from the cold of the high city. The site has temples, plazas, residential quarters, storage areas, agricultural terraces, and a remarkable water system that channeled spring water through a series of 16 fountains cascading down the slope, providing fresh water throughout the settlement. The Intihuatana stone, a ritual stone shaped into a gnomon, a shadow-casting instrument, sits at the highest point of the religious sector, aligned with astronomical events in ways that allowed Inca priests to track the solar calendar with precision. While Pachacuti worked on Machu Picchu and managed the administration of his growing empire, He also delegated the further military expansion to his son, Tupac Inca Yupanqui. From roughly 1463 onward, Tupac Inca was leading the armies north, pushing into what is now Ecuador and eventually pressing up toward the modern Colombian border. In 1470, approximately, Tupac Inca led the great campaign that brought down the kingdom of Chimar. The Chimu Empire, centered at the vast adobe city of Chanchan on the northern Peruvian coast. The Chimu were the Incas' most sophisticated rivals, a mature coastal state with a population probably larger than the Inca themselves at the time. With their own traditions of fine metalwork, textiles, irrigation agriculture, and political organization. They held out for a time, but the Inca cut the irrigation canals that fed Chanchan's surrounding fields, and the city surrendered. The Chimu craftsmen, the finest metalworkers and textile artists in the Andes, were transplanted to Cuzco, where their skills enriched the imperial workshops. Their administrators were incorporated into the Inca system. Their territory became part of Tontincio. Tontincio. This is the name the Inca gave to their empire, and it is important to understand what the name meant to them, because it was not simply a label but a cosmological statement. Tontincio means, roughly, the four parts together, or the realm of the four Siu, and the four Siu were the four quarters into which the empire was divided, radiating out from Cusco as the center of the world. Chinchisiu ran to the northwest, toward Ecuador and the northern coast, Antisiu to the northeast, toward the Amazon jungle, Calasuyu to the southeast, encompassing the Altiplano and much of modern Bolivia, Chile, and northwestern Argentina, and Cuntasuyu to the southwest, toward the southern coast. Cusco was explicitly conceived as the navel of the world. The Quechua word for it, Cusco, is sometimes translated as navel or center. And from it, the four highways of the empire extended like the spokes of a wheel, carrying soldiers and administrators and tribute and food and messages to every corner of the known world. Pachacuti died around 1471 at an advanced age, having presided over the transformation of a highland kingdom into an empire that stretched from Ecuador to the Bolivian Altiplano, from the Pacific coast to the edge of the Amazon jungle. His mummified body, dressed in fine clothing, attended by servants, seated in its golden chair, joined the gathering assembly of royal ancestors in the Coricancha. The empire passed to Tupac Inca Yupanqui, who would double its size in the next 20 years. But it was Pachacuti who had made the whole thing possible, who had looked at the Andes and seen not a collection of obstacles but an opportunity, who had designed a system sophisticated enough to actually hold an empire together at altitude. And it is to that system, the administrative and logistical genius of Tontincio, that we need to turn next. The Inca had no iron. They had no wheel. They had no draft animals heavier than a llama, which can carry perhaps 25 kilograms on a good day over difficult mountain terrain. They had no written language in the conventional sense, no alphabet, no logographic script, no system of marks on a surface that could be read by anyone who had learned it. And yet they administered an empire of roughly 12 million people, speaking more than 30 different languages, spread across 2,500 miles of the most topographically extreme terrain on the planet, with a logistical efficiency that the Spanish found astonishing when they arrived, and that modern historians still study with genuine admiration. How did they do it? The answer lies in a set of interlocking systems so elegant in their design and so precisely calibrated to the specific challenges of the Andean world that they deserve to be understood not merely as administrative tools but as genuine intellectual achievements. Begin with the roads. The Capac Nan, the Royal Road, the Great Inca Road, was, at its greatest extent, approximately 25,000 miles long, though some estimates run higher. This makes it comparable in total length to the Roman road network at its height. But the Roman roads were built across relatively flat terrain in the Mediterranean world, and the Inca roads were built across the Andes. The main highway ran north-south through the highlands for nearly the full length of the empire, from what is now southern Colombia to central Chile, climbing over passes more than 16,000 feet above sea level, descending into deep river gorges, crossing the Atacama Desert, the driest non-polar desert on Earth, and traversing every kind of terrain between them. A parallel coastal road ran along the Pacific shore. Dozens of transverse routes connected the highland and coastal highways, linking the empire's diverse ecological zones into a single integrated system. The construction of these roads was itself a monumental engineering achievement. On flat ground, roads were built of compacted earth or packed stone, often raised above the surrounding terrain to prevent flooding, edged with small stone walls and drainage channels. In mountain terrain, roads were paved with precisely fitted stone, with staircases carved into the steepest sections. Broad stone steps cut directly into the rock face, designed for human feet and llama hooves rather than wheeled vehicles. In marshy lowlands, roads were built on stone causeways. In deserts, the roadbed was marked by rows of upright stones defining the edges. The width varied from around 1 meter on difficult mountain paths to 15 meters or more on major highland highways near large cities. Every 20 kilometers or so, the roads passed through a tambu, a way station with storehouses, accommodations for travelers and soldiers, corrals for llamas, and everything necessary to sustain the movement of people and goods through that particular stretch of landscape. The sheer labor involved in building and maintaining this network was staggering. At any given time during the height of the empire, tens of thousands of MITA workers were engaged in road construction or repair somewhere in Tontensiu. They worked without iron tools. The Inca, like all pre-Columbian American civilizations, lacked iron technology, using instead tools of bronze, bone, wood, and stone, and without wheeled vehicles or the draft animals, oxen, horses, mules, that Mediterranean and Asian civilizations used for heavy construction. They moved stone weighing tens of tons using only human muscle, wooden levers, earthen ramps, and the organizational genius that could coordinate thousands of workers into a single productive effort. When the Spanish conquistador race arrived and saw what the Inca had built, they were so astonished that some of them, facing the practical problem of bridging the Panama Canal, reportedly suggested that Incan engineers should be brought to solve it, writing that to these builders nothing seemed impossible. And then there were the bridges. The Inca engineered more than 17 different types of bridges to deal with the complicated terrain, including floating reed bridges on wide rivers, stone arch bridges where conditions allowed, and the suspension bridges that became perhaps the most iconic symbol of Inca engineering ingenuity. These rope suspension bridges, called Cuashuachaca in Quechua, were built from braided cables of ichu grass or other natural fibers, sometimes up to a foot thick, stretched across river gorges and anchored to stone towers on either bank. The most famous crossed the Apurimac River near Cuzco and measured approximately 45 meters in length. The bridges were perishable. The organic fibers would degrade over time, so local communities were given the responsibility of rebuilding them annually as part of their imperial tribute obligations. In one remarkable case, the community near Huinchairi in Peru has maintained this tradition continuously to the present day, rebuilding the Queshuachaca Bridge every June using the same grass-weaving techniques passed down through the generations. But a road network is only as useful as the information that travels it, and here the Inca developed one of the most sophisticated communication systems in the ancient world, the Chasca Relay Network. Chasquis were young men, chosen for their speed and stamina, stationed in pairs at small relay posts built approximately 2 kilometers apart along the roads. When a Chasca carrying a message arrived at a relay post, his partner would run alongside him for a short distance, receiving the verbal message or taking the quipu record being carried, and then sprint off toward the next post while the first man rested. In this way, a message could travel from one end of the empire to the other at speeds of around 250 miles per day, faster than any horse. Fresh fish from the Pacific coast could reach Cuzco within 2 days. News of a military crisis in Ecuador could reach the capital before a marching army could cover a quarter of the distance. The quipu, those knotted string devices that served as the Inca's primary recording technology, are worth lingering on, because they represent one of the most unusual and still partially undeciphered information systems in human history. A quipu consisted of a primary horizontal cord, typically of cotton or camelid fiber, from which hung dozens or even hundreds of pendant cords of varying colors and lengths. Each pendant cord was knotted at intervals in ways that encoded numerical information using a base 10 positional system. A single knot could represent units, a cluster of knots tens, a different type of knot hundreds, essentially the same positional logic that underlies our own decimal system, expressed in fiber and not instead of ink in mark. The position of a knot on the cord indicated its decimal place value, the type of knot indicated the digit, and the combination encoded specific numbers. Specialists called quipikamaics, there were thousands of them throughout the empire, from high court officials to village headmen, created and read these devices. They used quipus to record census data, tax obligations, military inventories, storehouse contents, calendrical information, agricultural yields, and virtually every other kind of numerical data that an imperial administration needs. A quipu governing the labor obligations of a particular province might record, for each household, the number of able-bodied workers, the number of days of service owed, the types of work to be performed, and the destination of the workers. The color and twist of the cords apparently also encoded categorical information, distinguishing, for example, different types of goods, different administrative categories, different regions of the empire. The full system was complex enough that training a quipikamaic took years, conducted in state schools called yachuwasi, or houses of learning. There is growing scholarly evidence, though still contested, that some quipus may have encoded not merely numbers but narrative information, histories, genealogies, stories, in a phonetically or semiotically complex way that no one has yet fully deciphered. The Spanish destroyed thousands of quipus when they arrived, burning them as instruments of idolatry. Of the roughly 900 that survive in museums and private collections around the world, only about a third have been analyzed in detail, and the patterns within them remain largely mysterious. It is possible, it feels almost certain, given the sophistication of everything else the Inca achieved, that we are looking at a form of record-keeping far richer than mere accounting, and that the full history of the Inca Empire, the oral traditions and royal genealogies and military records that the Quipucamecs maintained, is still in some encoded form in the surviving strings, waiting for the right combination of linguistic analysis, computational power, and archaeological context to finally open it. Beyond roads and communication, the third great pillar of Inca administration was the mita labor tax. The Inca had no money, not in the sense of a standard medium of exchange. What they had instead was labor. Every adult male in the empire owed the state a certain number of days of work per year. This was the mita, the labor obligation, and in exchange the state provided the worker with food, tools, clothing, and coca leaves for the duration of his service. Mita labor built the roads and the bridges, the terraces and the temples, the storehouses and the administrative centers. It was mita workers who quarried the stone for Machu Picchu and carried it up the mountain. It was mita workers who wove the thousands of textiles that stocked the imperial storehouses. It was mita workers who staffed the armies that conquered new territories. The system was extractive. There is no other word for it, but it was also, within its own terms, reciprocal. The state fed you while it worked you, clothed you, housed you, and expected from you not permanent servitude but a periodic contribution to the collective project. The storehouses, kolka, were a crucial component of this system. They were built throughout the empire in standardized forms, typically circular or rectangular stone buildings constructed on hillsides above settlements, where the elevation and the winds kept temperatures cool, facilitating the long-term preservation of stored goods. The contents of these storehouses, dried meat, freeze-dried potatoes, a technology the high-altitude Andeans had developed over centuries, using the natural freeze-thaw cycle of the Altiplano to turn fresh potatoes into a storable, lightweight product called chuno. Dried fish, chicha, fermented maize beer, textiles, weapons, coca, feathers, amounted to a kind of imperial insurance policy. In years of good harvest, the storehouses filled. In years of drought or frost or crop failure, the state redistributed their contents to affected communities, preventing the famines that plagued less organized societies. Spanish observers in the 16th century were astonished by the abundance of what they found in Inca storehouses. One described the stores of Huánuco Pampa as sufficient to supply an army for years. The administrative hierarchy that managed all of this was, by the standards of pre-modern states, remarkably sophisticated. Below the Sapa Inca himself, divine ruler, son of the sun god, absolute authority in all things, was a small group of high nobles called the Sapa Incas Panica. The royal lineage descended from each previous emperor, who retained control of their ancestors' estate in mummy and served important ceremonial and advisory roles. Below them were the APU, the governors of the 4CU, typically close relatives of the Sapa Inca. Below them were provincial governors, district administrators, and finally the Caraca, the local leaders, often pre-existing hereditary chiefs whose positions the Inca preserved as long as they cooperated, incorporating them into the administrative hierarchy at the lowest tiers. The sons of subject people's leaders were often taken to Cuzco to be educated in the state schools alongside the Inca nobility, an arrangement that served both as a kind of sophisticated hostage-taking and as a genuine acculturation program. These young men returned to their home provinces speaking Quechua, familiar with Inca values and administrative methods, and far more likely to govern as willing participants in the imperial project rather than as sullen subordinates. The Atlas system deserves mention here as well. Throughout the empire, beautiful and talented girls, typically between the ages of 8 and 10, were selected by state inspectors and taken to special compounds called akalwasi, the houses of the chosen women. There they were trained in weaving, brewing chicha, and religious service. The finest became wives or concubines of the Sapa Inca himself, given to high nobles as political gifts, dedicated to temple service, or in the most sobering cases, prepared for sacrifice. The textiles they produced, technically extraordinary, woven on backstrap looms from the finest vicuña wool, in complex geometric patterns encoding religious and political meaning, were among the most important material products of the entire Inca economy, used in religious ceremonies, distributed as gifts to cement political alliances, and worn as markers of status that conveyed rank and affiliation as clearly as any uniform. The overall picture that emerges from all of this is of a state whose administrative genius was not merely organizational but deeply cultural. A state that understood that holding an empire together requires not just roads and soldiers but a shared sense of identity, a common language, a set of shared ceremonies and myths and obligations that bound the subjects of a vast and diverse empire to a center they might never visit and a god-king they might never see. What did daily life look like for the majority of Tawantinsuyo's 12 million inhabitants? They were overwhelmingly farmers, people who lived in small communities of Alis, who farmed the land communally, who organized their days around the demands of the agricultural calendar, who participated in the MIT system by giving periodic labor to the state, and who experienced the Inca Empire less as an abstract political entity than as a set of concrete obligations and material relationships. Roads they could travel, storehouses that might be opened in hard times, state officials who organized labor levies, priests who maintained the local huacas, and the general expectation that certain things would be demanded of them in exchange for certain protections. The Inca agricultural system was, by any standard, a marvel of adaptive engineering. At the highest altitudes, the Puna grasslands above 13,000 feet, llamas and alpacas were herded, providing wool, meat, and carrying capacity. The Altiplano around Lake Titicaca supported the raised field agriculture inherited from the Tiwanaku, and the freeze-drying of potatoes into chuno was a technology so effective and so well-suited to the Andean climate that it created a storable staple food that could last for years without deterioration. Below the Puna, in the highland valleys between 9,000 and 12,000 feet, maize was the prestige crop, used to brew chicha, offered to the gods, distributed to workers as part of state hospitality, alongside quinoa, potatoes, and various tubers. Lower still, in the warmer valleys, peppers, squash, and a diverse range of other crops thrived. And on the coast and in the lower eastern valleys, tropical fruits, cotton, and cocoa grew in climates that the highland populations could access through the vertical archipelago system. A deliberate strategy of maintaining colonies at multiple altitude levels to ensure access to the full range of Andean ecological zones. The terracing, the Andins, that transforms steep Andean hillsides into productive farmland represents one of the most visually striking engineering achievements of the Inca world, and it was also profoundly clever in its agricultural logic. A terrace cut into a steep hillside does several things at once. It creates a flat, irrigated planting surface on slopes that would otherwise be unusable. It flows the flow of rainwater down the slope, reducing erosion and allowing the water to percolate into the soil rather than running off. It creates a microclimate slightly warmer than the surrounding slope, because the stone retaining walls absorb heat during the day and release it at night, and it allows the farmer to manage soil quality across different levels. Inca terrace builders understood the local soil conditions and water sources with a sophistication that modern agricultural engineers, when they have analyzed surviving tariff systems, have found genuinely impressive. The overall picture that emerges from all of this is of a state whose administrative genius was not merely organizational but deeply cultural. A state that understood that holding an empire together requires not just roads and soldiers but a shared sense of identity, a common language, a set of shared ceremonies and myths and obligations that bound the subjects of a vast and diverse empire to a center they might never visit and a god-king they might never see. The Inca world was alive. Not metaphorically alive. Genuinely, literally, cosmologically alive, in the sense that every significant feature of the landscape was understood to be inhabited by divine or spiritual force, to have agency, to have desires and moods, to be capable of responding to human actions and requiring human attention. The mountain peaks were apis, divine beings, protectors of the communities beneath them, sources of weather and water and agricultural fortune. The rivers were sacred. The springs were sacred. The stones at the summit of mountain passes, where travelers added a small rock to the growing cairn as an offering, the apicada, were sacred. The Sikh system that radiated out from the Coricancha in Cuzco, the imaginary lines that connected more than 300 sacred sites across the landscape around the capital. Those lines were sacred. The sky was sacred, the earth was sacred, and the relationship between them was continuously managed through ritual, sacrifice, and the meticulous observance of a complex religious calendar. Inti, the sun god, was the supreme deity of the Inca state religion, and his preeminence was not merely theological but explicitly political. The Sapa Inca was the son of the sun, the literal descendant of Inti. His divine authority derived directly from this genealogical connection to the most powerful being in the cosmos. Inti was represented as a golden disk with a human face surrounded by rays, and his greatest earthly house was the Coricancha, whose gold shield walls were designed to catch and mirror his light. The most important festival of the Inca religious calendar, Inti Raymi, celebrated the winter solstice. In the southern hemisphere, this falls in June, when the sun appears at its lowest arc in the sky and must be symbolically called back. At Inti Raymi, the Sapa Inca himself led the ceremonies in the great plaza of Cuzco, offering chicha to the sun, burning offerings, and gathering the mummified bodies of all previous emperors, who were seated in their golden chairs and brought out to participate in the festivities as if they were still alive, because in the Inca understanding they were. The concept of the active, participatory ancestor mummy is one of the most striking aspects of Inca religion and one that had profound political implications. When a Sapa Inca died, his body was carefully mummified through a process that preserved his features remarkably well, and his panica, the lineage group descended from him, retained control of his palaces, his estates, his herds, his servants, all the wealth associated with him during his life. The mummy was attended by retainers who served its needs, fanning away flies, offering it food and drink, communicating with it through oracles and intermediaries, dressing it for ceremonies, carrying it to festivals. The dead emperors were believed to still be present, still observing, still capable of providing counsel and blessings. Their accumulated wisdom was a resource to be consulted. This system had an unexpected economic consequence. Because each new Sapa Inca's predecessors retained all their accumulated wealth in perpetuity, each new emperor needed to fund his own court and his own building program from conquest and expansion. He could not simply inherit his predecessor's empire but had to build his own wealth. This, some scholars have argued, created a structural incentive for continuous expansion that explains some of the extraordinary momentum of Inca territorial growth in the 15th century. A ruler who did not conquer new territory would be a ruler without resources, without prestige, without the means to attract allies and maintain power. Below Inti in the divine hierarchy stood a rich assembly of other gods and supernatural beings. Mama Quilla, the moon mother, was the wife of the sun god and the patron of women and of the lunar calendar. She was represented as a silver disk, complementing Inti's gold. Her temple was one of the 6 chapels within the Coricancha complex. Viracocha, the creator god who had shaped the world from the waters of Lake Titicaca and then wandered the earth-teaching civilization before disappearing over the western horizon of the Pacific Ocean, occupied an ambiguous position in the Inca pantheon, supremely important as a cosmological concept, but less central to the imperial cult than Inti. Ilapa, the god of thunder and lightning, was the deity that ordinary farmers prayed to most frequently, because it was his thunder, believed to be the crack of his golden sling, that brought the rain on which the crops depended. Pachamama, the Earth Mother, was not precisely a goddess in the Inca theology but something more fundamental, the earth itself as a living, feeling, responsive entity that required constant reciprocal attention. The Sikh system was one of the most remarkable expressions of this sacralized landscape. From the Coricancha, 41 imaginary lines, Sikhs, radiated outward in every direction, each line connecting a sequence of huacas, sacred sites of various kinds. Springs, caves, hills, rocks with unusual shapes, the sites of important historical events, the tombs of ancestors, temples, shrines. There were approximately 328 huacas in the Sikh system around Cuzco, and each had its assigned caretakers, its own ritual obligations, its own relationship to the agricultural and ceremonial calendar. The Sikh system was not merely a religious map but a kind of integrated cosmological administrative framework that organized time, space, social obligations, and spiritual attention into a single coherent whole. Scholars have argued that the Sikh system encoded the solar calendar, the irrigation network, and the social obligations of different lineage groups simultaneously, a multidimensional database built into the landscape of the capital. Among the religious practices of the Inca, perhaps the one that generates the most intense modern reaction is the capacocha, the child sacrifice ceremony. This was not a frequent ritual. It was reserved for major state occasions: the death or coronation of a Sapa Inca, a natural disaster, a great military crisis, an imperial birth, or the dedication of a particularly important temple or shrine. When a capacocha was called, the state sent out requests across the empire for children. Both boys and girls, though girls somewhat more frequently, between perhaps 8 and 15 years of age, physically perfect and beautiful, considered by the Inca to be the purest and most worthy messengers to the gods. These children were gathered in Cuzco and brought before the Sapa Inca, who presided over a great ceremony in the capital. Then they were sent out, accompanied by priests and attendants, along the Sikh lines to the specific sacred sites designated for their sacrifice, often the summits of the highest Andean peaks, places as close to the sky and the sun as it was physically possible to reach. The journeys to these mountain summits could take months. They climbed through altitude that left even acclimatized adults gasping, up slopes of ice and snow, to peaks that in some cases exceeded 20,000 feet. In the days leading up to the ceremony, the children were given coca leaves and chicha to dull their anxiety and numb their awareness. At the summit, they were placed in a small stone chamber or a shallow pit, often with lavish offerings, golden figurines, fine textiles, miniature llamas and silver bags of coca, arranged around them. In the coldest and highest sites, they simply died of hypothermia, slipping into sleep surrounded by their offerings, their bodies perfectly preserved by the extreme cold and dryness for 5 centuries. At lower elevations, the method was strangulation or a blow to the head. The 3 children discovered in 1999 near the summit of Huallaca, a volcanic peak on the Chile-Argentina border at 22,100 feet, the world's highest known archaeological site, represent the most remarkable and moving find in Inca archaeology. The oldest, a girl of approximately 13 now known as the Huallaca Maiden, was dressed in fine clothing with her hair elaborately braided, wearing a feather-adorned headdress. Analysis of her remains showed she had been selected as an Akla, a chosen woman dedicated to the sun, at around age 10, and had spent her last 3 years in the service of the temple. A bacterial infection in her lungs was the only sign that her short life had not been perfect health. She died in her sleep. The younger children, a girl of about 7 and a boy of about 7, were also exquisitely dressed and accompanied by offerings of remarkable finesse. They had been fed a diet that dramatically improved in quality in the months before their sacrifice, suggesting careful preparation and a genuine concern, within the terms of the Inca worldview, for their well-being. Along with the shrines and temples, huacas, sacred sites, were widespread throughout the Inca landscape. A huaca could be almost anything: a man-made temple, a mountain peak, a hill of unusual shape, a spring, a bridge, a large stone with a striking appearance, the site of an important historical event. The concept of huaca combined the sacred and the magical, the dangerous and the protective, in ways that European observers found difficult to categorize. A Spanish priest trying to extirpate what he called idolatry from an Indian community in the 17th century compiled a list of local huacas that ran to hundreds of items: springs, rocks, caves, field boundaries, ancestor mummies, agricultural tools of unusual effectiveness. The sacred was not concentrated in grand temples and formal religion but distributed through the entire landscape, present in every significant feature of the terrain that people had come to depend on. This diffuse sacralness was organized and structured by the Sikh system, the 41 imaginary lines radiating from the Coricancha, but it extended far beyond the immediate vicinity of Cuzco. Every important Inca city and provincial center had its own complement of local huacas and Sikh-like organizational systems connecting them. The mountain peaks visible from any given community were its local apis, and each apu had its own personality, its own history of relationship with the human community beneath it, its own demands and its own gifts. The largest and the most powerful apis, the highest peaks of the Andes, mountains like Ozangate, Salcantay, Ilampu, were of empire-wide significance, their moods monitored by specialized priests, their favor sought through offerings and ceremonies conducted by delegations from Cusco itself. We need to hold 2 things simultaneously when we think about Capacocha. One is that it was, by any modern moral standard, a horror, the killing of children, the destruction of young lives for reasons that seem to us meaningless. The other is that within the Inca cosmological framework, it was understood as an honor, as the highest possible form of sacred service, as a sending of the purest and most beloved human beings to join the gods as intermediaries for the welfare of the empire. The children were not discarded but elevated. Their sacrifice was believed to secure the continuation of the world, the rain, the harvest, the health of the emperor, the favor of the mountain spirits. To be chosen was, in this system, to be loved. This does not make it less terrible, but it does help us understand a civilization on its own terms rather than solely on ours. When Pachacuti stepped back from active military command and handed the responsibility for conquest to his son Tupac Inca Yupanqui, he was giving the empire to a man who may have been an even more brilliant military strategist than himself. Tupac Inca, whose name is sometimes spelled Topa Inca, and who reigned as Sapa Inca from 1471 to 1493, doubled the size of Tontinsiu during his tenure, extending it to what are now the southern borders of Colombia in the north and to central Chile and northwestern Argentina in the south. a territorial addition that made the Inca Empire the largest polity in the Americas at that time by a considerable margin. His northern campaigns pushed through what is now Ecuador, incorporating the powerful Cara people of the Quito region after a prolonged and difficult war. The Ecuadorian highlands were rich, fertile, well-watered, populous, and they would prove to be not just an addition to the empire but a second focal point, because the Sapa Inca Huayna Capac, Tupac Inca's successor, would spend so much time there that he essentially governed the empire from a northern capital, a shift that had profound consequences for Tawantinsuyo's internal politics. Tupac Inca also pushed the empire's eastern frontier into the Amazon basin, sending expeditions down the eastern slopes of the Andes into the tropical lowlands. These campaigns met with limited success. The jungle was a completely alien environment for highland warriors, and the forest peoples they encountered were experts in precisely the kind of terrain that gave the Inca no advantage. The empire's eastern frontier remained loosely defined, a permeable boundary rather than the clear administrative border that characterized the Inca world elsewhere. One of the most intriguing and debated aspects of Tupac Inca's reign involves reports in some chronicles that he organized a major ocean voyage, sending a fleet of balsa wood rafts westward into the Pacific and returning, after a journey of several months, with gold, a throne of bronze, and the skin and jaw of a horse, or perhaps a different kind of large animal. The description is unclear. Some historians have taken this account seriously as evidence of Polynesian contact. Others dismiss it as a later embellishment or confusion. The debate continues. His greatest military achievement, however, was probably the defeat of the Kingdom of Chimer, accomplished during his co-regency with Pachacuti before he became sole ruler. The Chimu represented the only significant rival power remaining on the Pacific coast, and their submission completed the Inca control of the coastal route between Ecuador and Chile. With the Chimu gone, Tawantinsuyo's western frontier ran from the Pacific Ocean itself, and the empire's access to the warm, fish-rich waters and the valuable spondylus shell, the mulu, sacred to the Inca and used as an offering throughout the empire, was secured. Tupac Inca died around 1493, and the succession passed to Huayna Capac, the young powerful one, who would be the last undisputed Sapa Inca, the last ruler of Tawantinsuyo before the forces of history, disease, and Spanish iron converged to tear the empire apart. Huayna Capac's reign, from roughly 1493 to 1527, was a period of consolidation and continued expansion rather than the explosive growth that had characterized his father's and grandfather's reigns. He spent much of his time in the northern territories in what is now Ecuador, where he fought a prolonged and costly war against the Caranqui people. A battle at a lagoon called Yahuacoca, the Lake of Blood, reportedly ended with the massacre of 20,000 Caranqui warriors, whose bodies were thrown into the lake, turning it red. Huayna Capac reportedly burst into tears afterward, not from remorse, the chronicles say, but because it disturbed him that it had required such extreme violence to subdue these particular people. He gave the lake its name himself. He built a new city near modern Quito, Tombamba, near the modern city of Cuenca in Ecuador, that rivaled Cuzco in its grandeur and served as a second imperial capital during his long absences from the south. He made additions to the road system, built new temples, expanded the aqueduct system, and added incremental territory to the empire's northern and southern frontiers. But by the second decade of the 16th century, a new and invisible enemy was already at work in the lands to the north. In 1517 or 1518, smallpox arrived in the Americas. Introduced by the Spanish on the Caribbean island of Hispaniola, it spread with horrifying speed across the interconnected trade networks of Mesoamerica and, eventually outpacing even the fastest human travel, it moved southward through the continent ahead of any Spanish presence. By the mid-1520s, it had reached the northern borders of Tawantinsuyo. The Inca and all the peoples of South America had no immunity whatsoever to this disease. They had been isolated from the Eurasian disease pool for tens of thousands of years and had developed no evolutionary or immunological defenses against smallpox, measles, influenza, and the dozens of other infections that European populations had long since adapted to in various degrees. The mortality was catastrophic. Estimates suggest that in some areas, populations fell by 60, 70, even 90% in the first generations of contact. Huayna Capac himself is believed to have died of smallpox around 1527 in the northern territories. He died suddenly without having clearly designated his successor. And this is where the catastrophe begins. In the Inca succession system, the Sapa Inca was supposed to designate his heir, traditionally the most capable son of his principal wife, the Coya, who was ideally a sister or half-sister. Huayna Capac had many sons. Two of them stepped forward to claim the throne. Huáscar was based in Cuzco, supported by the traditional Inca nobility of the capital and by the Panacas of the previous emperors. He was the son of Huayna Capac by his legitimate Coya wife and had a strong traditional claim to the succession. Atahualpa was based in the north, in Ecuador, supported by the battle-hardened armies that had fought Huayna Capac's northern wars under the command of some of the empire's most experienced generals, Cuzco, Calcucamac, and Ruminawi. His mother's status was more ambiguous, but he had the armies. The civil war that followed lasted from approximately 1529 to 1532 and consumed the empire with a completeness that is almost unbearable to contemplate in hindsight. Entire provinces were devastated. The logistical systems that had kept Tawantinsuyu running, the roads, the storehouses, the MITA labor networks, were disrupted or actively destroyed. Populations were displaced. Military conscripts were pulled from agricultural work, leaving fields unplanted and harvests ungathered. Huáscar's forces initially had advantages in the traditional Inca heartland, but Atahualpa's generals were simply better at the actual business of war. The conduct of the civil war was extraordinarily brutal by any standard. Huáscar, when he had the advantage, reportedly ordered the killing of Atahualpa's relatives and supporters with systematic thoroughness. Atahualpa's generals, when they finally triumphed, carried out reprisals on a scale that shocked even the chronicles written by people accustomed to Inca violence. Mass executions of Huáscar's supporters, the killing of his wives and children, the destruction of his Panacas' accumulated wealth. Calcucamac, one of Atahualpa's greatest generals, reportedly marched through the imperial heartland with an army that left devastation in its wake, not merely conquering but punishing, making an example of communities that had resisted. The human cost of the civil war, added to the ongoing devastation of the smallpox epidemic, had reduced Tawantinsuyu to a fraction of its former organizational capacity even before a single Spanish soldier set foot in the highlands. What is particularly tragic, in retrospect, is how unnecessary the whole catastrophe was. Had Huayna Capac lived another few years and clearly designated his successor, there would have been no civil war, no weakening, and the Spanish, had they come at all under those circumstances, would have encountered a unified, fully functional empire with a healthy population and a cohesive military command. Whether that would have been enough to resist the combination of steel, guns, horses, and epidemic disease that the Europeans brought is a genuinely uncertain question. The Inca armies were formidable. Their logistics, intact, were extraordinary. They had more soldiers than the Spanish could realistically oppose with their own numbers. But the epidemic diseases would have struck regardless of political unity. Smallpox does not care about successions, and the disease factor alone may have been sufficient to tip the balance. We will never know. History went the way it went, and the Inca who faced Pizarro at Cajamarca were not the Inca of Pachacuti's day but a people already shaken, already fighting each other when the strangers arrived. By 1532, Atahualpa's army had won the decisive Battle of Quipapa near Cuzco, captured Huáscar, and effectively won the civil war. But the empire that Atahualpa inherited was profoundly weakened. Smallpox had killed perhaps a third of the population and had destroyed the experienced political leadership at every level. Governors, generals, priests, administrators, all had died. The civil war had destroyed the unity of the remaining population, creating factions of Huáscar supporters who deeply resented Atahualpa and might be persuaded to assist anyone who moved against him. The road system that had been the empire's greatest strength was about to become the pathway for its conquerors. And out at the northern coast, a group of strangers on wooden ships, wearing iron and carrying weapons that spoke thunder, had just received permission from their king to invade. On a November afternoon in 1532, Francisco Pizarro stood in the empty plaza of the mountain town of Cajamarca and waited. Around him, concealed in the long stone buildings that surrounded the square, were 168 soldiers, 106 on foot and 62 on horseback, armed with steel swords, pikes, crossbows, 3 arquebus, and 4 small cannons. They were exhausted, filthy from weeks of hard travel through the Andes, frightened in the way that men are frightened when they know they have gone too far to turn back. Outside the town, on the slopes of the surrounding hills, the campfires of Atahualpa's army stretched away into the darkness. Somewhere between 40,000 and 80,000 soldiers, veterans of the Civil War against Huáscar, the finest military force on the American continent. There was not one of Pizarro's men who had not, in the small hours of the previous night, contemplated with considerable intensity the possibility that tomorrow he would die. Pizarro was born around 1478 in Trujillo, in the Spanish region of Extremadura, a region famous for producing conquistadors, men of modest origins and fierce ambition, whose poverty at home made the risks of New World adventure seem not merely acceptable but genuinely attractive. He was illegitimate, never formally educated, unable to read or write. He had been in the Americas since the early 1500s, had sailed with Vasco Núñez de Balboa when the latter became the first European to see the Pacific Ocean, had spent years in Panama scraping together enough wealth and connections to mount serious expeditions southward. He had heard the rumors that circulated among the coastal peoples, rumors of a vast and wealthy empire far to the south, a land of gold and fine craftsmanship and enormous organized populations. He had mounted 2 preliminary expeditions, one of which had actually reached the edge of Inca territory far enough to confirm that the rumors were real. In 1529, he sailed to Spain and obtained from the crown official authorization for conquest, the capitulation that made him governor of New Castile and commander of whatever territories he could subdue. He returned to Panama with a handful of reliable partners, recruited soldiers who were prepared to risk everything for a share of what they hoped was coming, and in 1531 landed on the coast of Peru with fewer than 200 men and 37 horses. What followed was one of the strangest and most consequential military campaigns in human history. Pizarro moved inland slowly, gathering intelligence, recruiting indigenous allies where he could, learning everything he could about the Incas and the civil war that had just ended. He learned that Atahualpa was camped near Cajamarca with a huge army, fresh from his victory over Huáscar. He sent his brother Hernando and Hernando de Soto ahead to meet with the emperor, and de Soto's account, riding his horse toward Atahualpa so that the animal's nose nearly touched the emperor's face, hoping to unnerve him, suggests a man already calculating psychological tactics against a target he was planning to attack. Atahualpa remained impassive. He agreed to meet the Spanish the following day in Cajamarca. What was Atahualpa thinking? This is a question historians have debated for 5 centuries without arriving at a satisfying answer. He knew the Spanish were coming. His spies had been tracking them. He knew they had horses, weapons of a kind his people had not seen before, and a different way of fighting. He also had tens of thousands of soldiers surrounding the town. He had just crushed his half-brother's army. He was, by any reasonable measure, in an invulnerable position. The most common interpretation is that he was contemptuous of this small, shabby group of foreigners, that he intended to meet them, assess them, perhaps capture them for sport or sacrifice or curiosity, and that he underestimated, fatally, both their willingness to act with absolute ruthlessness and the specific tactical advantage that horses and firearms would provide in a confined space against men who had never encountered either. The afternoon of November 16, 1532, Atahualpa entered Cajamarca in a procession of extraordinary splendor. He was carried on a litter lined with parrot feathers and trimmed in silver, borne on the shoulders of 80 high nobles dressed in vivid blue. Around him walked thousands of attendants, unarmed because this was a ceremonial procession, not a military advance. They swept the road before him. They sang. Their clothing glittered with gold and silver ornaments. The Spanish, watching from their concealed positions, were so overawed and so terrified that, according to one account, many of them urinated where they stood. Atahualpa entered the plaza, looked around at the seemingly empty square, and called out, surprised by the absence of people. A Dominican friar named Vicente de Valverde emerged from one of the buildings, accompanied by an interpreter named Felipillo, and approached the litter. What followed was one of history's most consequential theological confrontations, reduced by its circumstances to a grotesque farce. Valverde delivered the requerimiento, a formal Spanish legal document asserting the sovereignty of the Christian God and the Spanish crown over all peoples of the world, demanding that Atahualpa submit to the authority of Pope and King. The speech was long, theologically dense, delivered in poor translation, and entirely incomprehensible to an emperor who had grown up understanding himself to be the son of the sun, the divine ruler of the known world. When Valverde offered Atahualpa his breviary, his prayer book, as evidence of the authority he was citing, the emperor examined it, shook it near his ear, perhaps expecting it to speak, and threw it to the ground. Valverde hurried back toward Pizarro. What exactly he said to him has been debated, but the effect is not in doubt. Pizarro gave the signal. The cannons fired. The cavalry poured into the plaza from every opening. The infantry charged. The Inca attendants, unarmed, penned into the plaza, were cut down in the narrow space with extraordinary efficiency. The horses and the guns and the steel blades created a panic so complete that the walls of the plaza reportedly burst outward from the pressure of the crowd. Atahualpa's litter was tumbled. His bearers kept replacing the men who were killed and raising the litter again until there were no more bearers left, and Pizarro seized him with his own hands. Not a single Spaniard died in the plaza. The Inca soldiers camped on the surrounding hills, stunned by what they were seeing and in the absence of orders from their captured emperor, did nothing. The battle, or more accurately the massacre, of Cajamarca was over in perhaps 2 hours. Its consequences would take decades to fully play out. Atahualpa, a man of intelligence and perception even in captivity, quickly grasped what his captors wanted. He looked at the gold and silver objects the Spanish had been accumulating and confiscating with undisguised greed, and he made them an offer that has no equal in the history of extortion. He would fill the room in which he was being held, a room approximately 6.7 meters long, 5.2 meters wide, and 2.4 meters high, with gold, and fill 2 other rooms of the same size with silver, in exchange for his freedom. The room was marked at a height of 2.4 meters. Some accounts say he reached up and drew the line himself with his hand. And the Inca, following their emperor's instructions even in defeat, began to bring the gold. It came from temples and palaces, from storehouses and tombs, conveyed on llama caravans and on the backs of human porters along the roads that had made the empire great, flowing toward Cajamarca from every corner of Tawantinsuyo. By May of 1533, Pizarro had received all the treasure he had demanded. When it was melted down and refined, the gold alone amounted to roughly 6,000 kilograms, enough to make rich men of every soldier present, and to send back to the Spanish king a royal fifth, worth millions of pesos. Contemporary estimates suggest the total was equivalent to something in the range of 50 million gold pesos, a sum so enormous it disrupted the gold market of 16th century Europe when it reached Spain. Then Pizarro killed Atahualpa anyway. There was a hasty trial on charges of having murdered Huáscar, which Atahualpa had done on Pizarro's own suggestion apparently, and of plotting an armed uprising. The verdict was death by burning. At the last moment, Friar Valverde offered Atahualpa clemency if he would accept Christian baptism, and the emperor, perhaps hoping against hope that the Spanish would honor some agreement even now, accepted. He was baptized with the name Francisco Atahualpa, in honor of Pizarro himself, and then strangled with the garrote. He died on August 29, 1533. His last request was that his remains be sent to Quito. The fall of Cuzco followed within months. Pizarro marched south along the Royal Inca Road, accompanied by puppet Inca leaders and indigenous allies, including many who still bore resentments from the Civil War or from earlier Inca conquests, and who saw in the Spanish arrival an opportunity to settle old scores. In November 1533, the Spanish entered Cuzco. The soldiers who had been with Pizarro at Cajamarca had already been made wealthy beyond their dreams. The soldiers who arrived at Cuzco looted everything that remained, stripping the gold from the walls of the Coricancha, melting down sacred objects, dismantling the accumulated wealth of a century of imperial achievement into raw metal for transport to Spain. What was lost in those months, and in the decades of systematic destruction that followed, is almost impossible to calculate. The Spanish melted down the golden disk of Inti and the silver image of Mama Quilla. They melted down the golden garden of the Coricancha, in which life-sized figures of llamas, children, cornstalks, and flowers, all cast in gold and silver, had stood in the courtyard as offerings to the sun. They melted down the hammered gold sheeting from temple walls, the golden thrones and litters, the ceremonial vessels accumulated over a century of imperial tribute. They burned thousands of quipus as instruments of idolatry, destroying in those fires the records that could have told us how the empire actually worked, what the Inca themselves thought their history meant, what stories they kept in the knotted strings. They demolished Inca temples and built churches on their foundations. The Coricancha itself had the church of Santo Domingo constructed on top of it, its colonial Baroque walls still rising from the original Inca stonework, which has proved so much more durable that the earthquakes of subsequent centuries have repeatedly damaged the Spanish building while leaving the Inca walls below essentially intact. The epidemic disasters that preceded and followed the conquest were even more devastating than the military and cultural destruction. Smallpox was only the first wave. Measles, influenza, typhus, and other diseases followed in successive epidemics throughout the 16th century, each one killing populations that had no immunity and no prior experience of these diseases. Some historians estimate that the population of the former Inca Empire fell from 12 million in 1532 to perhaps 1 million by 1600, a collapse of roughly 90% in 70 years. This demographic catastrophe was not merely a human tragedy on an almost incomprehensible scale. It was also a cultural catastrophe, because the knowledge systems that sustained Andean civilization, the agricultural expertise, the astronomical knowledge, the keeper reading skills, the understanding of hydraulic engineering, the maintenance of irrigation networks and road systems, all of these depended on trained specialists, on lineages of knowledge passed from master to apprentice, and when 80 or 90% of the population died, Those chains of transmission were broken in ways that could never be fully repaired. But the empire did not collapse entirely and not immediately. One of Atahualpa's brothers, Manco Inca Yupanqui, had been installed by the Spanish as a puppet emperor, and for a time he cooperated, perhaps hoping to use the invaders against his own enemies and then restore something of the former order. By 1536 he had seen enough to understand that cooperation was not going to work. He escaped Cuzco, rallied an army estimated at some hundreds of thousands of warriors, and laid siege to the city in a campaign that came remarkably close to driving the Spanish out entirely. The siege of Cuzco lasted months. At one point, Manco Inca's forces captured the fortress of Sacsayhuaman above the city, and the Spanish had to fight a desperate hand-to-hand battle to retake it, during which Pizarro's brother Juan was killed. But ultimately the siege failed. The Spanish held on. Manco Inca withdrew, retreating deeper into the mountains. He established himself in Vilcabamba, a remote and nearly inaccessible mountain valley on the eastern slope of the Andes, where the cloud forest provided both concealment and resources. And from there led a decades-long resistance that the Spanish found enormously frustrating and never fully suppressed. Manco Inca raided Spanish supply lines, sheltered indigenous rebels, and kept alive the concept of legitimate Inca rule for more than a decade until his assassination in 1545 by Spanish refugees he had unwisely given shelter to. His sons continued the resistance from Vilcabamba, Seri Tupac to Dacusi Yupanqui, and finally Tupac Amaru, each ruling in succession as the Inca emperor of this diminished jungle state. The Neo-Inca state, as historians call it, persisted until 1572, when the Spanish viceroy Francisco de Toledo, determined to extinguish the last ember of Inca sovereignty, sent a military expedition into Vilcabamba. They captured Tupac Amaru, the last independent Sapa Inca, and brought him back to Cuzco. He was publicly beheaded in the main plaza of the city on September 24, 1572, in front of a crowd that reportedly wept. It was, officially, the end. The Spanish never found Machu Picchu. This simple fact, more than anything else, explains why the site is as well preserved as it is. Every major Inca city that the Spanish knew about was systematically stripped of its gold, had its temples torn down or converted into churches, its administrative buildings demolished and replaced with colonial architecture. Cuzco's Coricancha had a Spanish church, the Church of Santo Domingo, built directly on top of it, its golden walls stripped and its sacred spaces reoriented toward a foreign god. The city itself was transformed, its Inca street grid surviving in places but its monumental structures largely gone, replaced by Spanish colonial buildings that still stand today. In most of the Inca world, the physical evidence of what had existed before was overlaid, destroyed, or buried under 5 centuries of colonial and post-colonial occupation. Machu Picchu, retreating into cloud and vegetation on its mountain saddle, surrounded by terrain so steep that the Spanish road builders never had reason to build a road near it, simply ceased to be known outside the immediate vicinity. The Quechua farming families who lived in the valleys below knew of it. They had always known it was there in their landscape, part of the world they inhabited, but to the outside world, to the colonial administration in Lima and the scholars in Madrid and the historians in Europe, it was simply absent from the record. In 1911, an American academic named Hiram Bingham arrived in Peru with a somewhat different purpose. He was a Yale lecturer in South American history, fascinated by the Inca resistance, and he was searching specifically for Vilcabamba, the jungle capital where Manco Inca and his sons had held out against the Spanish. His expedition moved through the sacred valley of the Urubamba, following leads gathered from local farmers and Spanish chronicles. On the evening of July 23, 1911, camped at a place called Mander Pampa, Bingham met a local farmer named Melchor Artiega who told him, through an interpreter, of ruins on the top of the mountain above them. Bingham bribed Artiega with 3 times the going daily wage to guide him up the next morning. The next day, July 24, 1911, Bingham climbed through drizzle and mist, through steep terrain and dense vegetation, guided by Artiega and accompanied by a Peruvian military sergeant named Carrasco to the ridge above. There, in the mist, he found a small group of Quechua farming families living among the ruins, using the ancient terraces for their crops, their houses set among stones that had been precisely cut half a millennium before. And beyond those houses, emerging from the overgrowth, were the temples and plazas and residential quarters of Machu Picchu. White granite walls still standing, the stonework still tight, the precision of the Inca masons still evident in every joint, moss-covered and fern-draped but structurally intact, as though waiting for someone to pull back the green curtain and see what was underneath. Bingham returned in subsequent years with larger expeditions funded by Yale University and the National Geographic Society. He mapped, photographed, and excavated the site, removing somewhere around 40,000 artifacts, ceramics, mummies, bones, textiles, objects of bone and shell and metal, to Yale for study. The question of ownership of those artifacts would become a prolonged international dispute. Yale returned a significant portion of them to Peru in 2010 and 2011, and the process continues. Bingham himself was wrong about the identity of the site. He believed Machu Picchu was Vilcabamba, the last Inca capital, an error that persisted until 1964 when American explorer Jean Savoy correctly identified Espiritu Pampa in the deeper jungle as the actual Vilcabamba. Modern archaeology has established Machu Picchu as what it most likely was: a royal estate of Pachacuti, his private retreat and the retreat of his descendants, a place of religious significance and seasonal occupation that happened, by being forgotten by the right people, to survive intact into the modern world. The decades since Bingham have transformed our understanding of the Inca in ways that would have surprised him and that continue to develop. Archaeological excavations across the former empire have revealed the extraordinary scale and sophistication of Inca engineering, not just at Machu Picchu but at dozens of sites across Peru, Bolivia, Ecuador, Chile, and Argentina. The discovery and analysis of the Yuyayaca children in 1999 opened a window into Inca ritual practice and state religion that no document had fully described. Isotope analysis of bones and teeth from Inca burial sites has allowed researchers to trace the movements of individuals, revealing the reach of the MITA system and the forced resettlement policies that characterized the empire's integration of conquered peoples. DNA analysis of ancient Inca remains has shed light on the genetic history of Andean populations and the biological impact of the European epidemic diseases that struck before the Spanish themselves arrived. The Quipu research continues to be one of the most exciting and frustrating fields in Andean archaeology. Teams combining traditional humanistic scholarship with computational analysis and machine learning have been working through the surviving Quipus, looking for patterns that might unlock their full informational content. Sabine Hyland's research on a particular group of narrative Quipus from the village of San Juan de Calada has suggested that these devices encoded phonetic information, using fiber type and twist direction to create a kind of syllabary. Not quite an alphabet, but something analogous. If this interpretation is confirmed and extended, it would mean that the full history of the Inca, the oral traditions maintained by the Quipucameacs through the 15th and 16th centuries, is potentially encoded in the surviving strings, and that with the right decipherment key, we could hear the Inca tell their own story. The Quipu research continues to be one of the most exciting and frustrating fields in Andean archaeology. Teams combining traditional humanistic scholarship with computational analysis and machine learning have been working through the surviving Quipus, looking for patterns that might unlock their full informational content. Sabine Hyland's research on a particular group of narrative Quipus from the village of San Juan de Calada has suggested that these devices encoded phonetic information, using fiber type and twist direction to create a kind of syllabary, not quite an alphabet, but something analogous. If this interpretation is confirmed and extended, it would mean that the full history of the Inca, the oral traditions maintained by the Quipucameacs through the 15th and 16th centuries, is potentially encoded in the surviving strings, and that with the right decipherment key, we could hear the Inca tell their own story. Recent archaeological work has also dramatically expanded our knowledge of Inca provincial administration. Excavations at Huinaco Pampa in the central highlands of Peru, a major Inca administrative center that was essentially abandoned after the Spanish conquest and therefore never built over, have revealed a city of over 4,000 structures planned and built by the Inca state in the late 15th century, never previously inhabited, designed purely as an administrative and storage facility to manage the resources of the surrounding region. Its 33 storehouses could hold enough food and goods to supply an army for years. Its central plaza, larger than the main plaza of Cuzco, was designed to accommodate the mass ceremonies that bound subjects to the state: the feasting, the chicha drinking, the distribution of gifts, the performance of the rituals that transformed labor obligation into willing participation. The Inca, the excavators at Huinaco Pampa concluded, were masters of what one scholar called the archaeology of hospitality, the strategic use of generosity and ceremony to manufacture political loyalty at scale. The engineering analysis of Inca stonework has similarly deepened in sophistication. Studies of the interlocking joints at sites like Sacsayhuaman and the Coricancha have confirmed that the Inca used a specific technique of repeated fitting and grinding, lowering a stone onto the one below it repeatedly, marking and removing the high points, to achieve the extraordinary precision of their joints. Seismic analysis of the larger Inca walls has confirmed that their slightly irregular, pillow-shaped stone faces and their lack of mortar make them substantially more earthquake-resistant than the rigid colonial stonework built on top of them. When the 1950 earthquake severely damaged Cuzco, observers noted that the colonial buildings collapsed while the Inca walls beneath them remained standing. In the 2010 earthquake in Machu Picchu's region, the same pattern repeated. The Inca were not merely building for beauty or for power. They were engineering specifically for the realities of their tectonic environment, and their solutions have proved more durable than the European technology that tried to replace them. What would they tell us? The empire's genuine achievements deserve to be enumerated clearly, without the romantic embellishment that has sometimes distorted understanding of the Inca. They built a road system of extraordinary quality across one of the world's most challenging landscapes. They developed agricultural techniques, including terracing, irrigation, freeze-drying, the vertical archipelago model of farming that simultaneously cultivated crops from coastal sea level to highland altitude. They not only fed 12 million people but did so with a resilience and efficiency that modern agricultural scientists study with genuine admiration. They administered a multi-ethnic, multilingual empire over 2,500 miles with a degree of organizational sophistication that most pre-modern states never approached. They engineered structures that have survived 5 centuries of Andean earthquakes. They developed a recording technology that encoded complex information without a writing system in any conventional sense. And they created, in Tontinsiu, a state that genuinely did attempt to redistribute resources to prevent famine and provide for its most vulnerable members, even if the mechanisms of that redistribution were also mechanisms of control and extraction. But the Inca were also, by any fair assessment, a conquering empire with all the darkness that implies. Their expansion was often brutal. Subject peoples had limited choice about incorporation, resistance was punished harshly, forced resettlement separated communities from their ancestral landscapes, and the labor obligations of the MITA system, however theoretically reciprocal, could be genuinely grinding. The Capacocha ceremonies that seemed so spiritually coherent within Inca cosmology involved the deaths of children. The political purges that accompanied royal succession removed rivals with efficient ruthlessness. The empire was not a utopia, and the people who lived under it were not uniformly grateful. Separating the real Inca from the idealized and demonized versions has been a central project of Andean scholarship for the past century, and it is an ongoing one. Colonial Spanish chronicles were written by men with specific agendas, some trying to justify conquest, others trying to preserve indigenous knowledge, most doing both simultaneously in ways that make them difficult to evaluate. Indigenous accounts, filtered through colonial structures and often transcribed by people who misunderstood what they were being told, add complexity rather than clarity. Archaeological evidence is increasingly rich and increasingly precise, but it tells us about material culture and physical remains rather than the interior life of the civilization. The Inca remain, in many respects, a civilization we are still learning to read, and they are not merely historical. The present tense matters here. More than 8 million people speak Quechua today. Some estimates run as high as 10 million, making it one of the most widely spoken indigenous languages in the Americas. Aymara, the language of the Altiplano peoples who lived alongside the Inca and whose cultural traditions the Inca absorbed and were absorbed by, has roughly 2 million speakers. The agricultural terraces of the Inca, the Andins, are not merely ruins. In hundreds of Andean communities, farmers still plant potatoes and quinoa and maize on the same terraces their ancestors built, using methods that have been refined over centuries. The annual rebuilding of the Quechua suspension bridge in Huinchairi is a living ceremony, not a historical reconstruction. The communities of the Andes still call on the Apis, the mountain spirits, in their prayers. The earth, Pachamama, is still felt to be alive and requiring attention and gratitude. There is a continuity here that empires cannot erase because it lives not in gold or stone, both of which can be taken and melted down or toppled, but in language and land and the accumulated knowledge of how to live in one of the world's most extreme environments. The Inca built their empire on all of that accumulated knowledge, the 10,000 years of Andean achievement that preceded them, and they built so brilliantly that even their destruction could not fully undo what they had made. The stones of Machu Picchu fit together without mortar because they were shaped to bear the stresses of a seismic landscape, to move with the earth rather than resist it. There is a kind of wisdom in that, a philosophy of resilience, of working with nature's forces rather than against them, that feels increasingly relevant in a world that is discovering, too late in some respects, that the earth has its own intentions. Tontinsiu fell in 1572. The Inca did not. They are still there, in the mountains, in the language, in the land, tending the terraces their ancestors built and calling on the same apis that watched over Pachacuti and Huayna Capac and Atahualpa and all the millions of ordinary people who lived and worked and prayed and died in the greatest empire the Americas ever produced. The story is not over. It has merely changed form, moved from stone into the living, into the spoken, into the practiced, the way all the deepest human things eventually do. And that is where we will leave it tonight, high in the Andes, in the thin air and the long silence, with the mountains keeping their watch over a civilization that built itself out of stone and string and the organized labor of millions, that reached further and built higher and administered more brilliantly than any empire the Western Hemisphere had ever seen, and that fell not to a superior civilization but to a combination of catastrophic biological misfortune, internal division, and the focused ruthlessness of fewer than 200 well-armed men who happened to arrive at exactly the worst possible moment in the Inca's history. We covered so much ground tonight. We walked through the Chavan pilgrimage centers and the Moche pyramids. We followed Manco Capac's golden staff into the Cuzco Valley. We watched Pachacuti transform a highland kingdom into an empire by sheer force of will and vision. We traced the 25,000-mile road system and the knotted strings that kept it all organized. We stood in the sacred landscape where every mountain was a god and the dead emperors attended their own festivals. And we witnessed the terrible hours at Cajamarca when everything the Inca had built began its long unraveling. And then we followed the thread all the way forward to the present, to the languages and terraces and ceremonies that carry the Inca world into ours. If this kind of long, unhurried exploration of history is what you come here for, then a like on this video is a genuinely meaningful way to help this channel reach more people who might want the same thing. And if you haven't subscribed yet, please do. It is the single most effective way to make sure you don't miss what comes next. Every subscription is a vote for more nights like this one, more long walks through the past, more stories told at the right pace. Thank you for spending this time here. Rest well. The mountains will keep watch.